A story of silence. But listen closely. Connecting minds. Connecting from Africa for the world.
How could just one sentence move over 100,000 citizens into the streets, not to protest, but to pick up brooms? How could a nation that many had already written off as broken become almost overnight a case study in self-reliance? Not long ago, the reality in Burkina Faso was stark. In the capital and far beyond, waste piled into mounds that spilled onto roads and markets. Drainage systems, once meant to carry away the rains, had become stagnant traps of black water. The air in some districts carried the constant smell of rot, a reminder that no one, not the authorities, not the community, was coming to fix it. People walked past as if it wasn't there. Adults avoided meeting each other's eyes. Children played close to mosquito-filled puddles as though danger was something that belonged to another world. Beneath it all was something heavier than the waste itself, the belief that nothing would change unless someone else made it happen. That belief was about to be tested. It didn't start with a speech from a podium. It didn't arrive with the roar of sirens or the flash of television cameras. It came quietly, just a few words delivered without ceremony by a leader who understood that pride can't be imported. President Ibrahim Traoré said simply, "If you don't sweep your own doorstep, don't expect others to respect your nation." For most leaders, such a statement might be little more than a proverb for a slow news day. But here, in a country weary from decades of coups, broken promises, and a creeping sense of dependency, it struck differently. Those who heard it could not escape the question hidden inside. If we cannot keep our own streets clean, what does that say about us as a people? Within days, the signs began to appear. Students postponed study sessions. Market traders stepped away from their stalls. Women balanced brooms and buckets alongside their children. Soldiers traded rifles for shovels. There were no official uniforms, only the clothes they wore every day and the pride they carried into the work. No government trucks lined up with pre-packaged supplies. The brooms, shovels, and buckets came from the citizens themselves. And without formal orders, without a budget announcement, more than 100,000 people stepped out together. Some came to clean the drains that had been clogged for years. Others scrubbed walls whose colors had long faded beneath dust and grime. In the markets of Zogona and Larle, traders worked side by side to remove heaps of waste, replacing them with flowers and fresh paint. It was no longer just about sanitation. It was the first visible proof that the country was willing to stop waiting. Here's where it got interesting. Nobody sent out a memo. Nobody knocked on doors with a clipboard. But somehow word spread like a rumor you couldn't ignore. One street cleaned itself, then another. And before you knew it, whole neighborhoods were at it, digging, sweeping, hauling junk that had been sitting there so long it had practically claimed squatters' rights. In Zogona, the market where the smell used to hit you before you even saw the stalls, piles of rotting trash just disappeared. In their place, flower beds, fresh paint, people smiling, not because someone told them to, but because they'd done it themselves. Down in Gawa, soldiers who'd been carrying rifles swapped them out for shovels, knee-deep in muck to clear drainage channels. And here's the kicker. They weren't grumbling. They were laughing. The numbers started adding up fast. 400 kilometers of drainage cleared. 8,000 tons of waste gone, thousands of trees planted. And every single bit of it came from calloused hands in people's own pockets, not some foreign aid convoy rolling in with a logo slapped on the side. It wasn't charity, it wasn't politics, it was ownership. Messy, sweaty, back-breaking ownership. And that's when people outside Burkina Faso started paying attention. Once the momentum hit, it didn't stay in the shadows for long. Photos started popping up online, grainy phone shots of old men in sandals hauling broken kiosks, women in their 60s planting saplings, kids grinning with mud up to their knees. They weren't official press photos. They were raw, sometimes crooked, sometimes blurry. But they were real. And that's exactly why people kept sharing them. Burkinabe communities abroad started chiming in. In Paris, a group organized their own Saturday cleanup in solidarity. In Brooklyn, a community leader wrote, "If our people back home are rising with brooms, we will not sit idle in the comfort of clean streets abroad." It wasn't money they were sending, it was a promise to match the effort. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, something unexpected was happening. Markets that used to compete for customers now started competing for bragging rights over who had the cleanest stalls. Traders were sweeping, not just in the morning, but 2, 3 times a day. In Bobo Dioulasso, people were painting public walls they'd walked past indifferently for years. Even in smaller, often overlooked towns like Djibo and Gawa, men were reopening water channels so clogged they were more like compost piles than waterways. The media couldn't ignore it. South African anchors called it Africa's Clean Revolution. Kenyan commentators wrote op-eds asking, "If Burkina Faso can do this without aid, what's stopping us?" Even delegations from Mali, Niger, and Ghana showed up to see it firsthand. But here's where it gets tricky. When a movement grows this fast, it bumps into things. Old habits don't vanish just because the street's cleaner. Some people muttered, "It won't last." Others asked, "Where's the funding? How will this be sustainable?" And then there were the folks whose businesses had been encroaching on sidewalks or dumping into canals. Suddenly, they weren't so happy about all this civic pride. What happened next might be the most surprising part of all. You'd think after clearing 8,000 tons of garbage, everyone would be cheering. Not exactly. Some vendors had been using the same illegal kiosks for years, set right on public walkways. Others had been dumping waste into the nearest open canal because, well, that's how it had always been done. And now, the tide had turned against them. But here's the wild part. They weren't being chased off by faceless officials. It was their neighbors taking them apart, plank by plank. No shouting, no threats, just a hand on the shoulder and a quiet line. "We need running water so our kids don't get sick." You could see it land in people's faces. Not anger, but something closer to shame. This wasn't enforcement, it was social pressure. And in a place where community ties run deep, that's heavier than any fine. Still, not everyone bought in. Whispers floated around. "It's just for show. They'll get tired." Others were stuck on the money question. No budget, no aid, no sustainability. And that's where the conversation took a turn. Because here's the thing, the cleanup wasn't framed as a temporary campaign. The elders brought back something they remembered from decades ago. The first Saturday of every month when the whole neighborhood would sweep together. Churches and mosques started working it into sermons, not as a civic duty, but as a moral one. Schools slipped environmental care into lessons right alongside math and history. Bit by bit, the brooms stopped being a prop for a weekend project and started becoming part of everyday life. And that's when people outside Burkina Faso started seeing it for what it really was. Not just a cleanup, but a culture shift. Once the dust literally started to clear, something deeper began to move. It wasn't just that the streets looked better, it was the way people were talking. You stopped hearing, "That's the government's job," and started hearing, "This is our street." In Ouagadougou, neighborhoods set their own maintenance schedules. No one from City Hall told them to. In rural villages, elders started asking kids, "How have you served the land this week?" It wasn't a metaphor, they meant it. Religious leaders leaned in. On Fridays, imams tied cleanliness to spiritual duty. On Sundays, pastors slipped environmental care into sermons. Even the schools got in on it. Students planted trees on school grounds and dug waste pits themselves. And here's the kicker. When kids helped clean their classrooms, they stopped trashing them. That's not a miracle, that's ownership. And there were ripple effects no one had predicted. Local clinics started reporting fewer cases of malaria and diarrheal disease. Clearing stagnant water had gutted the mosquito population. Markets became safer, more inviting. Traders decorated stalls, laid goods on clean mats. Customers stuck around longer, spent more. Some folks even turned cleanup work into small recycling businesses. Still, you can't shift a culture without stepping on some toes. There were still skeptics, still the ones waiting for the broom to gather dust again. But the thing about a movement like this, it's harder to kill than you think. When people believe they're fixing something they own, it's not just a project. It's part of who they are. And that, more than anything, is what caught the world's attention. When the international press picked up the story, they didn't just file it under feel-good news from Africa. They called it something else entirely. South African broadcasters branded it Africa's Clean Revolution. Kenyan columnists asked, if Burkina Faso can do this without aid, what's stopping us? And then came the curveball. The story hit in places you wouldn't expect. Detroit, Baltimore, New Orleans, cities where older residents remember block cleanups, neighborhood gardens, repainting projects in the summer, places where community pride was once normal, until it wasn't. For Americans watching, it wasn't just a foreign success story, it was a mirror. One that asked, when did we stop sweeping our own doorsteps? That question stings, especially when you realize the we includes you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The conditions that existed in Burkina Faso, neglect, resignation, waiting for someone else to fix it, are alive and well in plenty of countries with far more resources. The only difference? They forgot what happens when people just start. And that's why the broom became more than a cleaning tool. It turned into a dare. A quiet but relentless challenge. If they can do it with no aid, no budget, no fanfare, what's your excuse? Here's the thing nobody says out loud at first. This was never about the trash. Yes, the garbage is gone. Yes, the drains are flowing. But the broom in someone's hand, it's not just for sweeping dirt. It's a declaration. It says, this is mine. I'm not waiting for permission to take care of it. And once you start thinking that way about your street, it's only a matter of time before you start thinking that way about your whole country. In Burkina Faso, the broom became the line in the sand between dependency and self-respect. It was cheap, it was common, and it was everywhere. But in the right hands, it became political without needing a single slogan. That's why it's stuck. You could hand someone $1 million piece of machinery and it wouldn't change a thing. Hand them a broom and suddenly they see what they can fix with what they already have. And that's dangerous, in the best possible way. Because the moment people realize they don't have to wait for a plan, a budget, or a foreign loan, you can't put that idea back in the box. It's the same reason the movement spilled over into the diaspora, into neighboring countries, into conversations far beyond Africa. The broom is portable. The mindset is contagious. This wasn't a cleanup, it was an identity check. Every movement that catches fire runs into the same danger. What happens when the spark fades? In the early weeks, the adrenaline carried everything. People were posting before and after shots, neighbors were competing over cleanest streets, and even skeptics were grudgingly admitting the place looked better. But long after the hashtags died down, real life has a way of creeping back in. Work gets busy, the rains return, the broom leans in the corner a little longer each day. Burkina Faso has seen this before. Bursts of energy that vanish as quickly as they came. That's why this time the stakes feel different. Leaders in the movement, many of them just regular citizens, are talking openly about the danger of sliding back. They're pushing for Green Saturday to stay permanent, for schools to lock in environmental lessons, for markets to keep their own cleaning crews instead of waiting for city trucks. But here's the tightrope. They have to keep the spirit alive without turning it into another top-down government program. The moment it feels like an order, the momentum dies. That's why, even now, the most visible leaders are still out there sweeping alongside everyone else. No one's hiding behind a desk. And hovering over all of it is the bigger question. Can a movement that started with a broom survive the weight of dim, politics, and human nature? Cleaning the streets was never the endgame. Once people saw what they could do with a broom in their own hands, the obvious question followed: what's next? For some, the answer was water. In towns like Jaibo and Gawa, clearing the old canals made them realize how fragile the supply still was. So volunteers started talking about repairing pumps, digging new wells, protecting water sources from contamination. Others set their sights on public spaces. Abandoned lots were being cleared not just for aesthetics, but for gardens, places to grow food that wouldn't have to be trucked in from miles away. In Ouagadougou, a group of young men who'd spent weeks hauling trash began organizing night patrols to discourage illegal dumping. Not police, not security contractors, just residents who didn't want to see their work undone. There's talk now about tackling school repairs, repainting clinics, even small road maintenance. And here's where it gets interesting. Some officials are nervous because every time citizens prove they can handle something themselves, it chips away at the old dependency model. If people can fix a school without a government contract, if they can keep a market clean without a municipal budget, well, that changes the balance of power. The cleanup was the test run. The next phase could redefine how this country works from the ground up. But that means the stakes just got higher. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. In Mali, Niger, and Ghana, delegations crossed the border just to walk the streets and talk to the people behind the brooms. They weren't there for photo ops, they wanted the blueprint. In Accra, a Ghanaian columnist wrote, "We wait for aid while Burkina Faso sweeps its streets with its own hands." That is the difference between hope and habit. In Nairobi, environmental activists began sharing the story alongside footage of their own clogged drainage systems, asking, could we do the same? Even governments that have built entire development programs around foreign funding are paying attention. Self-reliance might be contagious, and that's both inspiring and unsettling. Because if the lesson spreads that people can reclaim public spaces, clean water, and basic infrastructure without waiting for outside money, it could force a rewrite of how development is sold across the continent. And beyond Africa, the diaspora is still moving. Paris cleanups, Brooklyn street sweeps, community gardens in Montreal. They aren't just showing solidarity. They're making a point. You don't have to live in Burkina Faso to live by the broom. But here's the catch. When your movement goes global, you don't get to control the narrative anymore. And that sets the stage for the most critical moment yet. The drains are flowing, the streets are lined with trees, the air smells of wet earth instead of rot. But anyone who's been around long enough knows the real cleanup, the one that matters most, has nothing to do with brooms. It's about sweeping away the habits that kept people waiting, sweeping away the idea that dignity comes from permission, that respect is something granted instead of built. And the danger now isn't that the people will forget how to sweep, it's that they'll forget why they started. Old habits are patient. They'll wait for fatigue, for distraction, for the slow return of someone else will do it. The only way to beat that is to make the broom a part of life, not a weekend event. A culture, not a campaign. For those watching from abroad, this isn't just a Burkina-based story, it's a mirror. Think about your own street, your own market, your own community. When was the last time you fixed something simply because it needed fixing, not because someone paid you, not because it was your job, but because it was yours? If a country that's been through decades of instability can reclaim its pride one broomstroke at a time, what's stopping you? So here's the question I'll leave you with. What's the broom in your hand? And when will you start sweeping? If you believe that change starts with the people who show up, then don't just watch. Act, share this story, talk about it, and pick up your broom.